How's everyone doing today? Welcome to my fourth lecture in my series on Middle East politics. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the Golden Age of Islam. If you haven't done so, I recommend checking out my first couple of lectures that I did introducing students to what is Islam, what is the Sunni-Shia divide, as well as looking at Islam's relationship with other faiths such as Christianity and Judaism. They're all interesting lectures. I recommend checking them out. Now, for today, we're going to be specifically looking at this concept called the Golden Age of Islam. So, we have several goals here with this lecture. Number one, we want to understand why this Golden Age emerged and why it collapsed. At the same time, as you're going to find out, this golden age is also connected with the emergence of different types of theologies, what we call Mu'tazila and Asharite theology. The former theology, it's more open to rationalism, reason, and philosophy, whereas the latter is more religiously conservative, right? So we're going to talk about both of these. We're also going to understand the differences between Sufism and Salafism in the process. Sufism is a mystical tradition within Islam that is open to outside cultural influences, whereas Salafism is a more closed off tradition that is conservative and is more fundamentalistic in terms of its interpretation of the Quran. So, what really the main theme here of this lecture is about trends in Islam that are both open to the rest of the world as well as closed off to it. And also trying to understand why it is that civilizations sometimes become more open to the rest of the world, why they become more innovative, and sometimes why they close themselves off as well. And I think this lecture can also teach us a lot about what's happening actually in the United States today. And there's, of course, a lot of fears that within America, that American political power is declining and that we ourselves are becoming more closed off to the rest of the world. So we're going to talk about that a bit as well. So first things first, when did the golden age of Islam emerge? Well, part of this, of course, has to do with the Islamic conquest of the Middle East. And we talked about this in prior lectures. From 632 to 750 AD, the Islamic Caliphate, so first the Rashidun Caliphate, then the Umayyad Caliphate, conquered most of the Middle East and North Africa, establishing this very large empire that stretched from Spain and North Africa all the way to Iran and Central Asia. So this enormous empire was created. And in 750, a family from the Arabian Peninsula known as the Abbasids, they overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate and established a new caliphate, claiming authority over the Islamic community. This caliphate would last from 750 to 1250 AD. In the first couple of centuries, this caliphate would dominate the Middle East and North Africa. It would become very prosperous, economically wealthy, and politically powerful. And it is these dynamics that would lead to the emergence of the Golden Age of Islam. And at the center of this new caliphate was the capital, Baghdad. It's hard to believe now, but there was a time in world history where Baghdad was the wealthiest, largest, and most economically wealthy and politically powerful city in the world. It sat at the center of this huge empire where trade from all across the Middle East and North Africa ran through this city. And on top of that as well, this was a time of the Silk Road trade where there was trade from China all the way to Europe, and the Middle East sat at the middle of this trade, kind of as the middleman, making so much of the profits off of this long distance trade. Remember, you can't have a golden age of intellectual developments, of material developments, without access to a lot of funds, without access to a lot of money. And this big Abbasid Empire was able to take a lot of the tax wealth and a lot of the funds they gained from having this large empire and put it into intellectual development. Now, what's interesting about this empire as well, this golden age of Islam was not just about the achievements of the Islamic community. Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, the people of the book, also contributed to this empire. At the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Abbasids and their Arab allies could not just rely on themselves alone to run the empire. At the time, Muslims were still in the minority within this empire. The majority consisted of these peoples of the book, Christians and Zoroastrians in particular. And the Christians and Zoroastrians, their elites had previously run the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, the Christian and Zoroastrian empires of the past. They had a lot of experiences with tax collection. They had a lot of experience with literacy, keeping the books, creating an infrastructure, running a government. Whereas the Arabs, who previously came from the Arabian Peninsula, they didn't have this experience running these very big, large agrarian empires. So initially, both the Umayyad and then the Abbasid caliphates, they had to rely on these people of the book to help them run these empires. And as a consequence of this, they interacted a lot with these different religious groups. They intermarried with many of them. Of course, many of these Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians are going to convert to Islam eventually. So there was a lot of interactions back and forth, trade back and forth, and the sharing of ideas on top of this. So at the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate, this was a time of a lot of tolerance for other religions, as well as a lot of openness to different traditions. And thus, what would emerge from this is the golden age of Islam. So, what is a golden age? It's an age in which you get material prosperity as well as intellectual development. You get innovations in fields such as philosophy, mathematics, art, and architecture. This was the height of the pre-modern world in the Middle East in terms of its intellectual sophistication and its material sophistication. And it's at the capital, Baghdad, where we see it becoming this center of trade and artistic intellectual innovation. We also, as well, find within the provincial capitals throughout this empire, centers of trade and artistic development emerge. So places eventually, for example, like Cairo in Egypt in later centuries would become centers of these developments. Places like Fez and Marrakesh in Morocco, in Tunis and Tunisia, and Damascus in Syria, and elsewhere throughout the empire, they would become centers of intellectual development. And because the Abbasid Caliphate was so wealthy, these elites had a lot of wealth, these Arab Muslim elites, they had a lot of money to spend. Remember, if you want to spend your time doing things like working on poetry or philosophy or building grand works of architecture, you need the money to do this, right? Someone else has to produce your food, someone else has to build your housing. And thus, these Islamic leaders could pay for these intellectuals to engage in this type of activity. And so they began to build these institutions to foster this activity. Universities began to emerge. The word for university in Arabic is jamia. They began to build as well libraries and astronomical observatories. And one of the most special institutions built during this era was built by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, known as the House of Wisdom, known as the Beit al-Hikmah in Arabic. This House of Wisdom became a center for artistic and intellectual development where scholars from the Muslim, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Jewish world all came together to have discussions and debates. And one of the great things they did at this institution was they started to translate works from different parts of the empire. So the western part of the empire, right, consisted of parts of the former Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking world. They began to translate a lot of Greek works from the former Roman Empire into the Arabic language. Aristotle and Plato, for example, get translated, a lot of the work of these great Greek philosophers, as well as the great works of Greek mathematicians, Greek medical specialists, so Greek physicians, gets translated in Arabic. You also see works getting translated from Persian and Hindi into Arabic as well. So, for example, the number 0, which was developed in India, it makes its way towards the Arabic world. And this is going to have great implications for the development of Arabic mathematics, including the emergence of algebra. So all these different works, they get translated from these different cultures. And the Arabic language suddenly becomes a literary language, the language of the elites. So along with being the language of the Quran, it becomes the language of higher level learning. And these scholars end up contributing original contributions. So they didn't just translate these works, but then they built upon them, adding to philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and law. To give you a wonderful example of this, various mathematical concepts from Greece, Persia, and India came together to eventually produce algebra. Al-Khwarizmi, who was of Persian origin, he studied at the House of Wisdom, and he developed a number of works on mathematics, and he actually invented algebra. In fact, the term algebra itself, it's an Arabic term. It means el-jebr, which means to force one numbers from one side of the equation to another. If you remember from grade school, that's how algebra works if you want to solve algebraic equations. And of course, algebra is very useful for engineering. So a lot of this mathematics, it went towards engineering, went towards the building of palaces and mosques. On top of this as well, many of these very famous philosophers also focused a lot of their attention on astronomy, studying the stars. Over 2/3 of the stars in the sky that could be seen with the naked eye without a telescope actually have Arabic names today because of this era. So a lot was put into astronomy. On top of that as well, a lot of philosophers like Ibn Sina built off the works of Aristotle and Plato, writing their own works of philosophy. And of course, a lot of these scholars, they also made a lot of contributions to the development of Islamic law. So studying the Quran, Hadith, in order to really codify Sharia law during this era. So lots of developments in the legal field as well. And part of what emerged in this very open-minded environment were a lot of religious discussions and debates. There was freedom to debate Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And in fact, a lot of Islamic scholars used these debates to be able to write works of theology to better defend the Islamic faith. What also emerged out of this as well was this open-minded theological tradition called Mu'tazila theology. This was a rationalist view of Islam that mixed Islam with Greek philosophy. This tradition was kind of like what we know as deism today in the Western world, and developed by scholars, for example, such as Thomas Jefferson. You might be familiar with the Jeffersonian Bible, for example. Essentially, what Mu'tazila theology was a rationalist interpretation of the Quran. It argued that the Quran was not something that was eternal, okay, and created by God at the beginning of time. Instead, it argued that the Quran was created by Muhammad, who was only divinely inspired by God. And these rational scholars argue that while there were some good things to take from the Quran that were rational, there was other things you could ignore. You could pick and choose pieces of the Quran that were rational in nature that matched up with Greek philosophy. And so basically, this is kind of a more open-minded liberal tradition within the Islamic world at this time. And some of these Islamic theologians that came from this school of thought were open to doing things like drinking wine, for example, having open discussions on religion with other people from other traditions and faiths. So this is a very open-minded tradition here. And we could see here the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. Part of what made this era, a golden age, was the large expanse of land that the Abbasid Caliphate controlled. They had a lot of taxes to collect, right, from these different river valleys in Egypt and the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley and elsewhere. So lots of money came to the center of the empire. And because of a lot of trade that was taking place during these stable and prosperous conditions, merchants could also be taxed as well. So we had this very large empire stretching across much of the Middle East. And this prosperity spread beyond the Abbasid Caliphate. So because of the Silk Road trade, it spread to North Africa, to Islamic Spain, and into Hindu India, and into China. And so the Islamic world became the center of this great trade known as the Silk Road. And in fact, later in history, during the Renaissance, European scholars would be influenced by the work of these great Arab scholars, and it would influence the emergence of the Renaissance. So this was a very important era. And sitting at the center of these cities, such as here, we got Baghdad, you could see on the map, Cairo, in Tripoli, Fez, Marrakesh, cities such as Isfahan, Constantinople. It's going to become the center of this great trade. And at the center of these different cities, we see the building of these different fortified markets, what are known in Arabic as the souk. In these markets, You would have found places for merchants to trade their goods and their spices, the agricultural products, artisan crafts, as well as the trading of books, right? And of course, as well, next to these markets, we would find these great mosques, places where people can pray. We would find these universities, and we would find hospitals. They had hospitals that were at the center of these cities during the golden age of Islam. We would also find, on top of this, places for these merchants to be able to stay overnight. There were hostels for people to stay. So this was really a golden age of urban development. Cities grew during this era and they prospered greatly. Now, on top of this as well, we saw great innovations in agriculture during this era. Coffee emerged, originally domesticated in Ethiopia, and as it spread through the Middle East, Muslims began to develop methods for how to make different types of coffee. And so coffee houses became very prominent in the Middle East before they became prominent in Enlightenment Europe. Coffee houses we find throughout these different cities, and this became a staple of the Golden Age. Furthermore, there were developments as well in orchard agriculture. So things like oranges, for example, became very prominent, the development of other crops as well. So lots of innovations in the field of agricultural developments. Now, on top of this, these different political leaders of the Abbasid elite, they also began to invest a lot of money in architecture as well as showing themselves to be good Muslims, right? So this means establishing mosques and all the facilities that go with them. Now we can see with the architectural innovations of the mosque during this era, they borrowed a lot from Roman architecture, such as the arch and the dome, and they added to it. So here we could see the pillars, which are used to announce the call to prayer 5 times a day. So tons of architectural innovations here. And these innovations, by the way, would not have been possible without a lot of other developments. So, for example, there were developments in astronomy and the astrolabe. So astronomy, of course, helps study the stars. And you might go, well, why is that important? Well, stars are used to create better instruments for knowing what direction you're heading in, whether on land or sea, whether or not you're going north, south, east, and wests. The astrolabe here, what it does is if you know the positions of the stars in the sky, right, you could fix the astrolabe to know exactly what direction you are headed in. Very important, right? If you're a navigator, if you're a merchant, this helps with trade. On top of this as well, it helped Muslim architects know how to design their mosques so that the Qibla was facing towards Mecca. Remember, you have to pray towards Mecca. So thousands of miles away, they knew the direction of Mecca because of these innovations. And of course, these innovations in engineering are not possible without mathematics and without the work of scholars such as Khwarizmi. And every child in the Middle East today, every educated child knows who this person is. The Golden Age of Islam is taught in schools all throughout the Middle East. It's a source of pride for Muslims today, the fact that things like algebra were invented by these type of scholars. And there's all sorts of other words, by the way, that we find in the English language today that come from the Arabic language because of this era. So, for example, the word algorithm, this comes from the Arabic language. Uh, Other words, for example, a carat of gold, right? This comes from the Arabic world. So there's that merchant influence. Tons of other words that we take for granted today in the sciences and the arts, in basic things, even like furniture, like what an ottoman is, for example, comes from this region of the world. And on top of this as well, these individuals during the Golden Age of Islam also made great developments in terms of art. Now, Muslims during the Golden Age, they were highly discouraged from drawing images of human beings, right? You're supposed to worship nothing but God. So not only were you discouraged from drawing the Prophet Muhammad, but even any other human being. You're not supposed to worship political leaders, only God. So unlike the Roman Empire, a lot of the art during the Islamic age did not depict human beings. So they had to learn to develop art and take it in whole new and unique directions. And one of these directions was the develop of arabesque. Arabesque makes use of different geometric designs and floral patterns, such as what you're looking at in this image, and they do so in a very intricate way to design the facades of buildings, as well as other materials such as rugs, clothing, to these really beautiful sorts of designs. And so we could see this here on mosques. On mosques, they don't depict human beings. Instead, they depict these various floral patterns, these geometric designs. And we could see here with prayer rugs as well, right? So Muslims have to pray in a very clean space. They pray on top of rugs. And you could see here the use of these arabesque designs. On this rug to the right, you could also see the Kaaba. This is the stone that sits in the middle of Mecca that Muslims make the pilgrimage to. Notice here, this points the way towards Mecca, the rugs, right? So very important, these arabesque designs in terms of Muslim self-expression during the Golden Age. And of course, some of you might even have a rug in your home, right, that uses these type of designs. And also as well, one of the things the Arabs put a lot of work into was in calligraphy. Remember, the Golden Age of Islam, the literary works were translated in Arabic, and they developed all sorts of new Arabic scripts that were beautifully designed. So calligraphy becomes an art of its own, and we could see this adorning mosques, adorning books during this age. Now, a couple of important things about the Golden Age that are important to keep in mind. Unfortunately, these great works of liberal theology and philosophical achievements were something that were done mainly by the elites that were paid for by the Abbasid caliphs in places like the House of Wisdom. But this knowledge didn't filter down to the masses. You see, during the Golden Age of Islam, there wasn't the type of mass educational systems that you would later see in Western Europe. And when the average person did get an education, it was a basic education in the Quran. So basic religious learning, what was called a madrasa. So they went to a basic school where they would learn about the Quran, not about philosophy or mathematics. These new philosophical trends that emerged in the Middle East was mainly in the realm of the elites, not the masses. And in fact, this would also help explain the decline of the Golden Age and the emergence of modern Europe. So unfortunately, these philosophical traditions did not become a mass movement amongst the population. Now, what did become massively popular during this era instead was this mystical tradition called Sufism. Unlike philosophy, mysticism is an emotional type of an experience. So philosophers, they spend their time thinking, right? Thinking very hard about these existential questions. It can be a very stressful thing doing this, right? Discussing and debating religion. In contrast, mysticism and mystical traditions within Islam, such as Sufism, it's an emotional tradition. It's one about making a direct experience with God. Okay, it's all about feeling God, not thinking about God. And this trend emerged during the Golden Age of Islam, but amongst the masses. And Sufi movements, they were a rejection of the materialism of the Abbasid political elites, of the wealthy, of the philosophers. And instead, they put their focus into emotion. Okay, in fact, the word Suf itself means wool. It refers to the material worn by the poor. And so Sufism, it rejects this materialism and in favor instead of doing things that bring you a special emotional connection with God. So doing things, for example, like dancing, engaging in music, poetry readings, doing special types of prayers and chants over and over again to develop these feelings of euphoria. Some of you may have felt this before, for example, going to a concert, right? Otherwise known as the feels, right? You're feeling the moment. You're not thinking about hard existential questions. Instead, you're becoming one with the moment. And for Sufis, they felt that this was actually becoming one with God, just by becoming immersed in these traditions. And so it's all about making that personal connection with the deity, with your creator, not with becoming obsessed with philosophy. And here's the thing with Sufism. Sufism is also part of what made Islam incredibly popular outside of the Arabian Peninsula as it began to spread to the Middle East and North Africa. Of course, many people converted to Islam for the tax breaks or because of fear of political oppression or for political opportunities, but others were attracted to this mystical tradition. And Sufi Muslims, they also often borrowed for cultural traditions outside of the Arabian Peninsula, borrowing from musical styles, borrowing from different types of poetry and art, and special types of uh, rituals that were involved, for example, praying to ancestors, for example. So Sufi Muslims, they borrow from these different religious cultural traditions, and this made Islam more acceptable to the masses outside the Arabian Peninsula. It drew a lot of people to the faith. It's a lot easier to track the masses to a faith when you're promoting music as opposed to promoting philosophy. And so, thus, Sufism is a very open and tolerant tradition with Islam, generally speaking. It's more open to outside cultural influences. Now, these Sufi Muslims, they tended to form these special brotherhoods, these what we call these Sufi orders, known in Arabic as tariqa. Tariqa literally means the way, the path. So Sufi Muslims would establish these orders and they would have these set rituals involving prayers, music, dancing as a way to kind of add on to the five pillars of Islam, these other traditions, so that people in their free time could make this special connection with God. And so there were religious fraternities. Now, I have to emphasize that Sufism was not like a political sect. It wasn't like Sunnism or Shiism, right? It didn't make political claims. And in fact, often Sufis often rejected politics, right? Ignoring the political elites in favor of, spending more time connecting with your creator and your community. So these were religious fraternities, and many of them were founded by these famous Sayyids, these descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And so many Sufis felt these Sayyids had a special blessing to give to their followers. And when these Sayyids died, special pilgrimages were often made to the sites of deceased saints. Mosques were built on these sites and pilgrimages were made. And special institutions known as Zawiya were established for these Tariqa orders, where all these special rituals would be held. And so thus, it is Sufism that becomes massively popular during the Middle Ages, during the Golden Age of Islam, and not these philosophical traditions associated with the Golden Age. Now, of course, while these developments during the Golden Age, the philosophical traditions, mathematics, were incredibly important for world history, for the average Muslim during this age, it's Sufism that really made an emotional connection with them. And so thus, Sufism has this kind of tradition of tolerance and love. I'll give you this one great example from Jalaluddin Rumi, very famous Sufi and poet who was very open to other faiths, had this very tolerant rhetoric. Let's look at one of his famous quotes here. Listen with ears of tolerance, see through the eyes of compassion, speak with the language of love. Open yourself up to other people. Feelings of love lead to a special connection with your deity, with God, right? God is said to love his creation, and you should love him back and love his creations back. Now, if you want to see some of these artistic, these are kind of this musical traditions, for example, in how they take place, I recommend watching this YouTube video. I show these to my students in class. You yourself can go and take a look at it, listen to some of this music. So it's you could see from listening to this why this would be so attractive to so many people. And as a consequence of this, throughout the Islamic world today, we find all sorts of Sufi orders. There's dozens of them in different parts of the Middle East. And they all have their different traditions, and they vary greatly from one order to the other. So all across the Islamic world, tons of different Sufi orders out there. And what they do is they color Islam. They give it a lot of variety. They add to those five pillars, right, to it, giving different traditions in different parts of the Islamic world to this faith. All right, the decline of the Golden Age. So what happened to end this Golden Age? Well, part of what led to this Golden Age was the decline of the Abbasid Empire itself. If an empire breaks apart, it'll lead to a decline in the wealth needed to sustain this intellectual development. So just like when the Roman Empire declined, when the Abbasid Empire declines, we're going to see a decline in intellectual activity. This decline began sharply in the 10th century, and a lot of this had to do with climatic changes. Desertification took place throughout the Middle East. The deserts of the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula began to spread north. This seriously hurt agricultural productivity throughout this region of the world. Many people had to give up on farming. We see a growth in pastoralism, and in turn, this leads to less tax wealth, right? If people are farming less, that's less agricultural produce to send to cities. Tax wealth declines, that's less money for these empires. And on top of that, that means weaker militaries. That's less money to pay your soldiers. And so when the military of the Abbasid Empire starts to weaken, the empire starts to fall apart. One of the things that happened during this era is that nomadic invaders from Central Asia, from Turkish and Mongolian descent, they begin to invade the Middle East and North Africa, and they begin to disrupt the politics of the Abbasid Empire. And what starts to happen as well is provinces within the Abbasid Empire, they start to break apart and form their own empires. So, for example, we get in Tunisia, the Aghlabid governors, they form their own dynasty in Tunisia as the Abbasid Empire starts to get weaker. And this happens elsewhere throughout the empire. And these Turkish and Mongolian invaders were often destructive. So, for example, the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258. So we get this severe destruction of infrastructure. And with the decline of cities and urban life, this also leads to the decline of trade throughout the region. And that leads to less wealth for rulers to be able to spend on intellectual development. So the economy starts to decline. This happened over the course of several centuries. And in the process, the Abbasid caliphs begin to lose control. And the empire just slowly collapsed, finally fully collapsing in 1258 AD with the disastrous invasion of the Mongols. The Mongols tore the city to the ground. They killed most of its inhabitants. Baghdad would never be the same again. And so what ends up happening is that when you get economic and political decline, what starts to happen is that Muslims in the Middle East start to become less open to outside influence and innovation. And we see this happen time and time again with civilizations. When things start to go badly, people become less trustful of outsiders. They become less open to innovation and change. In fact, we even see this with world survey results, right? So when people experience economic deprivation, when they think their lives are getting worse, they become more xenophobic, less trustful of outsiders, of immigrants, of migrants. And thus, we see a decline in innovation, less openness to outside traditions, less openness to change. Part of also what led to the more conservative attitudes in the Middle East wasn't just the decline economically of the region and the political decline of the Abbasid Empire. It was also, over time, the gradual conversion of religious minorities to the Islamic faith. We went over this last class. Slowly over time, because of economic and political pressures, more and more people began to convert to Islam. But as the amount of religious diversity declines, this means that there's less diverse debates happening. There's less diversity within this empire. It becomes more homogenous, the Abbasid Caliphate, this big empire. And thus, there becomes less openness to having debates on these issues. And so this is also another reason for this decline. And as the conservative attitudes grow, so does the opposition towards the liberal theological traditions and the Greek philosophy that emerged during the Golden Age. And a new theology emerged called Asharite theology, which became the popular theology amongst Muslim intellectuals by the end of the Golden Age. And it's a Muslim theology that rejects Greek philosophy and the use of reason. It rejects a liberal interpretation of the Quran in favor of something that's more fundamentalist. It argues that the Quran, was something that's eternal, that it emerged with the beginning of world history, and that God revealed the Quran to Muhammad. So they argued against the Mu'tazilite theologians in favor of a strict interpretation of the Quran. And so they promoted a strict Orthodox Sunnism, and they rejected Mu'tazila theology. And eventually, Mu'tazila theology would decline, and for the most part, nearly disappear. Okay. Now, in recent history, in modern history, there's going to be some attempts to bring this back, and we'll talk about that in future lectures. But for now, know that during the decline of the Islamic age, we get this kind of Orthodox Sunnism, this conservatism that's really settles in. And so what ends up happening as a result of this conservatism is innovation declines in the Islamic world, right? We get less people who are open to innovations in mathematics, philosophy, and other academic traditions. And I'll give you the greatest example of this, one of the most prominent examples. The 11th century theologian El-Ghazali, who wrote this very famous work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And you could just tell from the title that he was against Greek philosophy and Mu'tazila theology. And he actually used the logic of Greek philosophy to argue against Greek philosophy. So this was a theology that argued for Orthodox Sunnism. He basically argued that philosophy and mathematics was the work of the devil, that by having open discussions and debates on religion, you entice people to move away from Islam. You create unbelievers. And when you do that, you get moral decay. And when you get moral decay, society collapses. And scholars such as himself blamed the decay of the Abbasid caliphates and what was happening in the Islamic world on openness and blamed it on innovation. He argued that we needed to return to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. We needed to get back to the past if we wanted to avoid decline. So that was the argument he made, that innovation was bad. It was corrupting the Islamic world. So he thought numbers was the work of the devil, right? So when you have that sort of theology that sort of dominates, it's not going to leave a lot of intellectual room for innovation. And one of the consequences of this as well was that there was also a backlash against traditions such as Sufism and Shiism, anything that was seen as an innovation that moved away from Sunni Islam. So many Muslims have rejected Sunnism. Now, I do have to keep in mind, and this is very important, Sufis can be both Sunni and Shia, but for very conservative intellectuals, they felt that Sufism was starting to introduce traditions that were anti-Islamic, that were getting too far away from the teachings of the Prophet, that were making people too open-minded, and that this was leading people to fall away from the faith. And so many Muslims, during the decline of the Golden Age, they started to turn away from Sufism. They saw it as corrupting the faith with its innovations. And one of these famous scholars, and this was the century, by the way, that the Abbasid Caliphate collapsed, was Ibn Taymiyyah. He grew up in Damascus, and he was a very prominent theologian. And he argued that Sufism, Shiism, and Mu'tazila theology, that all of these things were innovations that were corrupting the true Islam. They emerged in the aftermath of the Prophet's life, after his death, and he argued they needed to be rejected. And furthermore, he also thought that Muslims should not engage in anything outside the 5 pillars when it came to their faith. You should stick to the 5 pillars, right? Praying 5 times a day, believing in one God, fasting during Ramadan, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, and giving to charity. Beyond that, you should not engage in any of these traditions. So he rejected singing, dancing, music, and other forms of artistic expression. So in other words, this is the no fun part of the faith, right? So he was rejecting all forms of things that take your attention away from those 5 pillars of Islam. And so he called for this strict following of what he thought was the original form of Islam. And in fact, this would lead to the emergence of an intellectual trend called Salafism. This Salafism calls for a return of the pure form of Islam. And the term Salaf itself means ancestor in Arabic. So that's what a Salafi is. So someone who seeks to return to the distant ancestors, specifically to Muhammad and his companions, and the true form of Islam. So that's why his followers became known as Salafi. And Salafis are some of the most conservative Muslims in the world. They stick very closely to tradition. They reject outside innovations. And in today's world, they are often opposed to the influence of Western cultural norms, right? Things like feminism, for example. So they are very much opposed to change. And during the decline of the Golden Age in the centuries that followed, Sufism would experience a very slow decline. There's still plenty of Sufis out there. But Salafism would start to grow in popularity in the following centuries. And as we're going to discuss in a later lecture, it would eventually inspire the emergence of something called Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. So Salafism would emerge to contest the innovations of the Golden Age, whether it be the intellectual innovations of the elites or the mystical practices of the majority of Muslims. So suddenly, Salafism starts to take a hold of the Middle East while Sufism has declined throughout the region. And, if you want to spot a Salafi, many married Salafi, typically what they do is they grow out their beards throughout the course of their lives. This is following in the example of the Prophet Muhammad. So they follow the letter of the law to the T, even following the very little things that Muhammad did throughout the course of his life, like grow out his beard. Growing out your beard is supposed to send a message to the rest of the community that you're married, right? And you're taken, and it's meant as well to show a sign of your conservatism, that you're a true Muslim. So Salafis, they tend to grow out their beards very long, whereas many liberal Muslims don't grow out their beard at all, or they keep it very clean, and they don't let it grow out to be so long. If you've ever seen, for example, a picture of Osama bin Laden, he grew out his beard to be very long. In fact, many radical jihadists today within the Sunni world, they tend to be Salafist. Although I do have to emphasize, most Salafis are not involved in terrorism, although they are very conservative when it comes to their faith. And of course, women who are very conservative also tend to dress very conservatively. Some wearing hijabs that cover all of their hair and even parts of their face, and some wearing the niqab, which covers all but the eyes. And so usually the more conservative you are, the more that women will cover up more and more of their body. So throughout the Islamic world, Salafism has grown in popularity. And this is just showing you a map in the Middle East where Salafism is the most popular. Now, in the heartland of the Middle East, particularly in Arabia, where Islam started, this is where Salafism has the greatest hold. And it also has a hold on a lot of Sunni Muslims in places like Iraq, Syria, as well as Egypt today. So many Sunni Muslims adhere to it. Now, with that said, Sufism is still popular in many parts of the world. It's very popular in Turkey as well as parts of North Africa, especially Morocco. Furthermore, there are traditions that reject Salafism. So Shia Muslims obviously reject Salafism, right? So in Iran today, which is a 12 Shia majority country, they reject Salafism. And Turkey today also has a very liberal Islamic tradition. Sufism remains very popular today there as well. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to send those questions on my YouTube page. Just leave a comment down below, and I will do the best I can to answer those questions. Have a good day.